everybody, here we are inside the Magick Circle. This is Jason Augustus Newcomb, and I am talking today with someone who I'm really excited to speak with. She is the premier witch for hire in the greater Pittsburgh area, as well as the author of a book that I like quite a lot called the Orphic Hymns Grimoire, and I'm looking forward to talking with her about that. I'm speaking, of course, of Sara Mastros. Welcome, Sara.
Hi. I'm excited to talk to you too.
What's that?
I said I'm excited to talk to you too.
Your microphone is actually a little lower all of a sudden. Did you turn something down?
No.
Okay, well, just make sure you're speaking passionately. We'll get through this.
I used to teach high school, and I was so loud that the teacher from across the hallway would come across and close my classroom door. So probably it'll be okay.
Okay, so I want to interview you in sort of three separate chunks today. The first chunk, I want to talk a little bit about the Orphic Hymns Grimoire, because I'm very excited about the book, and I want to just dive into it a little bit with you. And then I want to talk to you about you and your practice and what you do and what you believe and what you think and how you practice in as much detail as you can go into. I love to talk to people about that. It's one of the things that people like about these interviews. And then finally, I want to talk to you about your new book that's coming out in a few months, which is a book about...
Until November. It got
November?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll talk about that at the end, and that's a book about incense of various kinds. So to begin with, the Orphic Hymns Grimoire, I've really enjoyed reading it and working with it for the past few weeks. It's a terrific book. I've got Patrick Dunn's Orphic Hymns book as well, they came out kind of around the same time, didn't they?
Yeah, it turns out that Patrick and I were like both working on those translations at roughly the same time. And like we vaguely knew each other from just like, I don't know, Facebook Hellenic pagans. We kind of all at least a little bit knew each other. Mm-hmm. But like, I don't think either of us knew the other one was doing it until basically they both, like his advertising campaign came out at basically the same time as my Kickstarter.
you're like, oh gosh, this is...
Yeah, and I felt really bad because he'd been working on it longer, right? Like I just started talking about mine basically in the beginning, and he didn't really tell anybody until it was already written. So his was definitely first. But we had a conversation. We both agreed that like our styles are very different. Like we're doing different things, and that there's more than enough room for both of them. And I will say, Patrick's came out toward the end of me finishing mine. And I will definitely say, like, I think I got to stand on the shoulders of giants. You know what I mean? Like, I think mine was stronger for having had his to work with as well.
So you got to actually look at his a little bit before you released yours.
My translations were more or less already done by the time I got his, which I think, I don't know that, I think it was a week or two after it came out by the time I got it. But there were definitely places where like his reading, there were places where like, look, his Greek from a technical level is much better than mine, unquestionably. Like he's like a classicist linguist.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm just like a person who taught myself Greek by reading books that had Greek and English in them both. And like some of my older relatives speak modern Greek, so I kind of had it in my ears.
So I don't think they're really, I mean, they obviously are in competition with each other. If you just can afford one, you have to make a choice. But I don't think from a structural standpoint, they're really in competition with one another at all. Like you said, he takes a very different pass through the information. It's much more of a literal translation than yours, and yours offers some different stuff that his doesn't offer, and his offers some different stuff that yours doesn't offer. So really, they do both belong on the shelf, I think.
And really, I think that for almost everybody, like the Thomas Taylor translations are so good and also freely available. So honestly, between you and me, I think by the time anybody pays any amount of money for the Orphic hymns, they sort of already have the Taylor translation that
they're all in on it, and they probably want both copies, right?
And, so at that point, I think they buy me and Patrick and I lost his name, Athena.
I haven't actually read that translation. I apologize. If you want to come on the show and be interviewed, I'd love to have you. But so let me talk to you for a second about the things I really like about your book. Sure. We'll leave Patrick's aside. Well, actually, before we leave that topic, let me just ask you one question. How do you not get angry and jealous of another person who's writing a book at the same time? Like what? Like how do you process that in your mind in a positive way? Because I feel like it doesn't happen to me, but I feel like if it did, I would feel a little uncomfortable.
See, I feel like that's how I feel about Patrick, but I felt the opposite. Like he was clearly ahead of me. Like when I found out, I was still early enough in the project that I could have just been like, oh, well, guess that's done. Which is when I reached out to him and be like, hey, man, I was not intending to step on your toes. Like, I didn't know you were doing this, and I'm still early. Like, I can just shut this down if you want. And he and I talked a little bit, and it became clear that we had these very different things. And I actually think we both drive sales of each other, because I will say, like, basically everybody who buys mine, I also recommend his, because I think by the time somebody's buying Orphic Hymns, I think they're the kind of person who sort of wants to like triangulate between multiple translations.
Yeah, and that has been my plan for a long time, and so I'm really glad that both of the, I mean, what a wonderful time we live in that there are 2 modern translations of the Orphic Hymns for people to take a look at, or 3 if you want to look at the more the more scholarly versions as well. So the things I really like about your book, you've got a lot of art in it, a lot of pictures that are cool, that I guess you work with an artist friend to create.
I do. So the illustrator, his name is Brian Charles. He's been my like longtime BFF and like co-magician. So really, anytime you see any work from me with illustrations in it, it's either like public domain paintings for some of them, or like his work, which I love. And the icons, like I really wanted to, there's not icons for all of them.
Sure.
So we tried to sort of pick out the ones where like there weren't good. You know what I mean? The gods that like I wanted to have a picture of on my wall, but like I couldn't really find a good one. Right? So we did that. And then there were also some that like to me sort of like came as an inspiration. Like I knew what I wanted them to look like. So the Okeanis one, for example, I drew that one. I mean, I drew like some stick figures and labeled it. And I was like, make this good, please. Some of them, like say Hephaestus or Hercules. I think that's his best one. That's my favorite of his, and that's all him. So like he's a comic book illustrator, and I feel like his Hercules is like really comic book superhero-y.
Sure, yeah. Well, there's definitely a very modern feel to the art in it, and also a lot of, not all, but a lot of the translations have a fairly like present day feeling to them. What made you decide to translate them so freely to bring in some more modern feel into it?
Well, translating is complicated, right? And I'm going to be a little, stop me if I ramble too long. I'm going to be kind of pedantic in my answer here. Like, translating is doing a lot of complicated work, right? And I think that, so for me, when I think about translating ancient texts broadly, right? One of the things I read a lot about is like Bible translation, because that's the same period and the same language. And it's the same kind of translation in the sense that like I really am trying to capture like a spirit of the text and not just a word for word text, which I think is also what most Bible translators are attempting to do. And conveniently, that's a text that like, the internet will give me 40 different translations of every line to like compare. And so I started thinking a lot about like, when you're translating something from a really foreign culture, foreign in any sense, right? So, but in this context, like that's really our culture rolled back in time. That is one of the roots of our culture.
Yes.
Like, there's this tension between making a text feel very foreign by keeping it very like tight to the culture it's in a way that sometimes when we read it, like we actually totally miss the point. Right? So like in the Bible, a lot of times it'll say like, and then they wrote it on shards of clay. And I feel like when I read that in like sort of just like my naive understanding of it, I think like that's not as strong as written in stone, but like written in a tablet of clay, that feels like powerful. But what they actually
almost as good as stone, right?
Right. What they really mean is like they scratched it on some trash. Like in a modern sense, that would be like if I just picked up an empty envelope and like wrote a note on it, or like the back of my bar receipt.
Because it's shards of clay, you mean?
It's shards of clay, and clay was like the cheapest material they had.
Sure.
Right? They just threw that stuff out. So like, and so you can turn the other way. So if instead of translating shards of clay from like, which is a literal translation, right? If you translate it as like, they
leftover stuff
it out on garbage, right?
Right.
Like that's called domesticating a text, right? You're taking somehow like the way I think about it, my goal when I am translating is not to tell you what ancient writers said. It's to, like, that ancient Orphic bard, he is like saying words in order to make people think and feel things.
Sure.
And in a magical sense, like, to make them think and feel like these are hymns, like the thing that the hymn to Hecate is trying to make you feel is Hecate. Do you know what I mean? And so my goal, more than like capturing the word for word, the sort of like literal translation, like that's not my goal at all, right? My goal, which I think is similar to like Thomas Taylor's goal in his translations, which are similarly non-literal to mine, like they're approximately the same amount of literal. My goal is to like write a new English poem as close to the Greek poem as I can, while actually implanting in like a modern English speaking hearer, like the same feeling that I think the legendary Orpheus was trying to instantiate in his apocryphal ancient Greek audience.
And I think that you're successful in doing that. I mean, I think there's still a place for Thomas Taylor's work, and I think there's definitely still a place for Patrick Dunn's work, and obviously, you know, other scholarly translations, both past and in the future. But I do think that you've managed to capture a really nice, you know, you can use them as modern sort of ritual speak, and they feel both magical and contemporary. You know, there's a like you're entering into a feeling zone with a lot of them.
I understand Orphism to be a living tradition.
And so what do you mean by that?
I mean, like, I do not believe this to be a lost tradition that we are resurrecting from ancient roots. I think that the Orphic hymns have been in continuous play in our culture pretty much the whole time. Now, that's not exactly true, blah, 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 but like for a long time, those Orphic hymns have been a continuous part of our culture that not just like that shaped what our culture is, right? And I think there has been a continuous telling. I understand the Orphic hymns to not really be written teaching, but to be oral teaching, to be like a teaching that is intended to like be different when different people tell it. It's intended to like evolve and change with the times. And I think the Orphic hymns have done that. I think every time, I think that I am not the first person, like, who tried to replant the Orphic hymns in their time. I think that's what Taylor's doing. I think that's what a lot of Latin translators were doing.
So what is Orphism to you then? And, you know, how does that play into
so I
hymns?
think that's a really complicated question, right? And
short but complicated.
ML West is a scholar I really like. He says, this might not be perfectly word for word because it's off in my head, but he says something very like, Orphism is the tradition of naming things after Orpheus. And like, I really do think that the same way that like I often, you know, on like random internet magic boards, I often see a question like, what spirit should I invoke to help me learn Solomonic magic? Like that spirit is Solomon, and the spirit who like guides Orphism is Orpheus. Like if it comes from Orpheus, it's Orphic. But in a more technical sense, Orphism is like a strain of Grecophone paganism that has its like own cosmology, which largely centers on Persephone and Dionysus, right? Okay. But Orphism is also, and a lot of times when like non-Orphic writers in ancient Greece are writing about Orphism, in addition to having its own cosmology, I think a more important distinction is that it has its own style of practice, right?
And what is that?
Orphism is a really like ecstatic and charismatic practice. They're like the snake handling churches of their day.
Oh, okay.
Like they have a reputation for that, for being like wild and foreign and inappropriate and filled with undesirables like women and slaves and foreigners. Like it is not a socially acceptable practice.
That sounds almost a little bit like Tantra from India. Do you feel like there's like a, you know, thematic connection?
I don't know enough about the history of Tantra to say that. Like based on my like, I know a lot of Westerners who say they're tantrics and I believe them.
Right.
And also a lot of Westerners who say they're tantrics and I don't believe them. But there are plenty that I do believe. Based on what they tell me, I would say probably yes, but I really don't know enough about Tantra to answer that question, but I think so, yes.
So, well, just the outsider nature of it and the ecstatic nature of it seems like there's not that there's necessarily a historical connection, but just sort of a theme. I see, like, I think culture kind of like imitates itself in different places, not necessarily because they've communicated, but just because humans do things certain ways.
Honestly, like that thing that we're talking about, the thing that like Orphism and Tantra share, I call that witchiness.
Okay, sure. that's
witchy. Yeah.
So back to the text itself. One of the things that I really enjoyed in reading it is the little historical bits that you put in there. They're both very well written and also like give they're fairly short, and they give information that I hadn't seen elsewhere before in places. So it's a nice little way of getting some context for it.
Thank you. Really, what happened was like they were things that I didn't necessarily know before I started really digging into that Orphic hymn. Because a lot of times I would read the hymn and I'd be like, huh, that's weird. Does it? Like, because I read the Taylor one and then I read the original Greek and I'm like, huh, that's not really what that said, bro. Like, or like I misunderstood it or Taylor misunderstood it. Or just like there was stuff in there that I didn't really know or understand. And I had to do some deep dive research. And then I was like, oh, well, here's all the stuff I learned. You should learn it too. They start off with translation notes, I guess is what I'm saying. And then
right, yeah. No, but I mean, it's. I almost wish that there was one for every single one of them. You know, like it's you picked and choose. Obviously, you'd have a 1,000-page book if you did exactly the same thing for every single one. But
I tried to do more for the ones where either I felt like I had personally a lot to say, or which was a lot of times was the ones where like I think they're a little less widely known. Like in truth, say Athena, who is both really well known and like lots of brilliant people write and talk about her, but also like in truth is not necessarily like, I'm not saying I have anything against Athena. She's fine, but she's not like necessarily one of my gods.
She doesn't charge you up personally.
Right. So I mean, I don't. Maybe she would if I got to know her better. Like in truth, like the real truth is that like I have some friction with Athena because Athena is like who my father wanted me to be, and I'm maybe not. But like I understand that's about me and not really about her. And also my BFF named his daughter Athena 4 years ago, so I had to like crash course and get good at it. But what I mean to say is like, I feel like people who aren't me have a lot to say about Athena that would be much better and more useful than anything I have to say. Or like, I don't have anything new to say about Athena.
There'd be hidden digs in there maybe that you didn't even mean to put in.
Yeah, right.
I also really like the fact that you've got a number of actual spells that you include throughout it, or ritual actions that you can do. But there aren't a huge number of them though. What made you choose the kind of ones that you put in? Same reason or something else?
It's almost the opposite reason. So the ones I had spells for are the ones that like I use that spell most often, right? So like I do some witch for hire business, and like those are the sort of questions you get. Like I need to make some money, I need to get out of debt, I need to get a job, I need to curse my enemies. Which I will say, all the Malefica I just pushed there's a pretty clear political cast to the Malefica in the book. Like, I framed it as political Malefica. There was a lot of political stuff going on while I wrote this book. So they're just the ones that like I had spells for. Gotcha. Or like sometimes while I was writing their hymn, I don't know, they asked for one. Like if they taught me a spell, it went in the book. And if they didn't, then they didn't get one.
I also noticed that some of the a couple of the translations, at least, I didn't poke back through it. I noticed you had dedicated to someone, like you'd done the translation for their wedding or something like that. Is that true of a lot of them, or was it just that one happened to be there?
There's a couple. So some of them are like during my Kickstarter, some people like bought, like they sponsored certain, right? But a lot of them were just like, there's a lot of like, gods appreciate it when you do things like translate and publish their hymn. Like, at least I feel like, and this is probably more about like the kind of person I am, but I feel like what the gods really want from me is like PR. Sure. So I also feel like when I do good PR, I can like trade that for something. So some of them like sort of dedicated themselves as I was doing the work, right? Like there was there was something in my life that like I needed that hymn for, and so I
Mhm.
translated that one, right? So the hymn to righteousness is dedicated to my neighbor Antoine Rose, who was shot by police, like while I was doing that. I mean, not my next door neighbor, but in my neighborhood neighbor,
Sure.
and like that happened while I was doing like that series of translations, right? Or the one to the Furies, for example, I
Mhm.
did. There's two hymns of the Furies. I don't remember which one, but one of them I translated during the Kavanaugh hearings. So some of the dedications were like about things that were going on in my world that like brought themselves into the hymn, and the hymn like pushed its power back out, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. I totally but so some of them were just sort of like, oh, I got to do this one at this point, and you slogged through it.
Like, I decided in advance, right? Like the hymn to Athena. Remember I said that my BFF named his daughter Athena?
Mhm.
The hymn to Athena is dedicated to her. Like I
Are
already knew
there
that was going to happen before I started translating.
are there any of the hymns in there either in the form that you created them or in their original form that you just don't like at all, or?
Not like is complicated. The hymn to Apollo, I will say, I think of the translations, the hymn to Apollo is probably my worst work. And
Oh,
it's because like I don't like, I'll be fully clear. There's some stuff going on in that hymn that I don't fully understand.
mm,
Which there's like some technical musical jargon in it, which like I got some I am like shamefully non-musical. Like I can't carry a tune in a bucket with two hands, kind of not musical. So like I got some modern musicians to explain it to me, but I don't. I feel like if I had a better understanding of like musical theory from Greek late antiquity, probably that hymn to Apollo would be amazing, because it's a hymn written by a bard cult, so you would assume
right.
Apollo one would be really good, but I think maybe I just don't get it.
How much do you think music plays a role in how these hymns would have been used originally?
I think that it probably depended from bard to bard. So I think some bards basically just like emphatically read them the way I would,
Hmm.
right? And I think that many bards sort of sang them a cappella or with like a lute, right? So I think it really depended. I believe, though I guess I don't really have any justification for this belief, but I believe that like different people did them different ways, and like I would imagine the bards who were singing them were perhaps more popular, like that was the good bard.
Hmm.
But like there weren't that many bards. You were happy when anybody, like any bard came to town. If it was me and I can't sing, but I talk real good,
You.
I'm sure that was fine.
But so I mean, Orpheus is I mean, like best known. His myth is about him being such an amazing musician that he was
Sure.
able to basically break into Hades and get out again.
So
So.
here's the thing. Greek ain't the distinctions between like singing
Mhm.
and I guess what we would call like poetry performance, spoken word performance in Greek are like not maybe as distinct as they are for us.
Here's what I'd like you to do, if possible. We'll see how the gods like this.
Yeah.
Um, could you share maybe your favorite one of the hymns that you've translated and just read it for us
Oh,
right now?
yeah. I'm gonna read you one that is my favorite,
Okay.
but is also Hermes. So perhaps you
Okay.
will
Well, let's hope
figure
Hermes,
it out.
please.
Let's see. He's in the middle somewhere. You would think that at this point I would know what order they're in, but I totally don't. I mean,
I
I
assume
know
you didn't. I assume you didn't translate them in order.
I did not. So I translated them usually just based on like who I felt like that day.
Which was the last one you did? Do you remember?
Well, I do them in a bunch of passes.
Hmm.
The one to Apollo is the one that like I felt like I just gave up on. And I'm still like, I'm not happy with my translation of the hymn to Apollo, which I feel like, I'm not saying the other ones are all perfect, but that I think that's the only one I'm really unhappy with. So the hymn to Hermes is probably my favorite, definitely my favorite of the Olympians,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like he and I have a very long standing relationship. You can't really see, but I have wings tattooed on the sides of my head behind my ears. So there's actually 2 translations of the hymn to Hermes because I just went too far off the script. So I'm going to be this is the author's preferred version, not the literal version.
So this is you really going creative with the.
Yeah, and I feel like Hermes is the sort of god who appreciates that in a way that like other people would maybe prefer you stick to the script.
We shall see.
I sing of high Hermes, beloved worker of wonder, first of the Pleiades conceived when she dreamed of bright thunder, all-powerful game master, lord of the dead, true-thinking foreteller of what lies ahead, code-cracking con artist, jail-breaking the shibboleth, killed peacock-eyed Argus when you bored him to death. Wing-sandaled human friend, fast philanthropic prophet, rejoicing in racers and instructing pickpockets. You spin hermeneutics like you're spitting hot rhymes. You're the father of fraud, rearing up lies. But that same trickster offers genuine peace. Blameless, irreproachable machine of surcease. Corsian luckbringer, blessed loquacious one, comrade of the worker and those under the gun. Employing clever rhetoric, venerable friend, pray for your initiates when our lifetimes end. Boast about our work and our charismatic rhymes. Memorialize our memories for future lifetimes.
Wonderful. And so, but that's probably the furthest out that you get.
That's the one, and I do provide also a more literal translation.
And I mean that in terms of adding a lot of modernisms and so forth into it.
I think if anybody who reads Greek, or if you go to like a very literal translation, like one of the super academic ones, like I think my lines are all recognizably present in the Greek. Like I have definitely stretched them, right? And in no way, like, I mean, that one I felt like, oh, that's too far, Hermes. Like, even I think it's cool, but somebody's going to complain, so let's do a more literal one too. You'll also see if you compare the two, they actually start off almost identical, and then halfway through, the one you heard starts to get a little. I mean, again, it's still, I still think it is line for line recognizable as the same text.
Well, at least so far, Hermes seems pleased. We haven't had any further technical difficulties as a result of it. So, my wife liked it. She's sitting here in the background. So let's talk. Maybe we'll come back to this subject, but let's talk a little bit about you and your first of all, you call yourself a witch for hire. What does that mean to you?
I feel like witch for hire is actually like mostly the same in all cultures. So when I look at something like the Greek magical papyri, right? Some of them are clearly like sort of magical training texts, right? In a more like sophisticated and like fancy, like priestly tradition. And some of them are clearly more like recipe books from like the guy on the corner that you went to for a spell, or like the old lady down in the bad part of town who you went to curse somebody. And I feel like, yeah, that's the same job I do, right? So people come to me for, honestly, a relatively short list of relatively boring and mundane concerns. Help me get it done. And remember, we were talking about the Orphic hymns before. What are their spells for? That's what there are. Help me get a job. Help me sell my house. Help me get a lover. You know, like, it's just the things people want from magic, right? And I feel like really the only way that has shifted over time is that like medicine has carved out a lot of it, right? Like the line between what is medicine and what is magic is there's like a much cleaner line there than there used to be historically. But other than that, when I look at historical witch for hire texts, like I understand that like me and that granny are in the same profession.
Sure. One of the things that's odd in the Greek magical papyri, though, is that, you know, some of the deities that you call upon in order to accomplish those limited goals are not really what we would associate with them today. I can't recall. Did you associated them pretty much with our modern understanding of things, right? Like, for instance, you know, in the Greek magical papyri, if you're doing a love spell, sure, maybe Aphrodite might be involved, but it also might be Typhon instead. You know, like
what they are like, what those aren't really love spells; those are rape spells. So actually, Typhon kind of does make sense.
Sure.
I guess. You know, I think it's what I always tell like magical students is like, you don't need 8 million gods for 8 million different things. You only need like 2 or 3 people. And like, you just go to them for everything. And if they don't want to do it, like they will introduce you to somebody else who does. And I think in the ancient world, you know, I think it's easy to forget that like you and I and anyone else who's like even remotely well read in the subject today knows like a lot more with a lot more like depth and cross-cultural and historical context about those gods than perhaps those people do. Like they have very deep knowledge of them, but like we have like a zoomed out perspective that they don't have. And like the amount of books that we have at like those, they had like, especially the like witch for hire who lives down the block kind of, right? The not the priestly ones. Like that person, they had 1 teacher, maybe 2 teachers. Like if they were lucky, they own a book. Maybe 3 books. Like they don't have that many options. And so they know those options really, really well, right? Like I think that, you know, like you, there wasn't really an internet when I was coming up. So like when I found a book, that was like the magic book I had for the next like 4 years until I found another one that was like anything good. So I really like delved into those particular books. And I think that provides a depth, but not necessarily a breadth.
Right. Let's talk about that. Like what brought you into magic? How did you discover that you were interested in magic? How did, you know, from...
You know, I grew up witchy, I guess. So my father was like culturally Greek, but like at least by the time I was born, pretty militantly atheist. And my mom was like, you know, Reform Jew-ish, but like we weren't religious and she didn't grow up religious and my grandmother didn't grow up. Like nobody had been religious in a long time in our family, but like, you know, you're still Jewish. We still did Jewish things. And, you know, I'm the sort of person who's interested in that sort of thing. So like I maybe got into those things more. So I definitely grew up with the understanding that like there was like big G God, right? And then there was like little g gods, which would be like Zeus or Jesus, or Santa Claus would be like in that type of category. Which I definitely understood those 3 to be of the same type.
The Zeus and Jesus and Santa Claus are in the same pantheon or same like level of
pantheon? Like honestly, difficult to distinguish.
Okay.
Like here's the thing about me and Santa Claus though, like you know, my family wasn't religious, but my mom ran for quite a while. My mom ran the daycare in the homeless shelter where my father dressed up as Santa Claus and handed out presents. So like Santa Claus had a real sort of like really religious vocation in my life in a way that like if my father had a god, that god was Santa Claus. My dad also looked like Santa Claus. Like
he looked like Santa?
I mean, he looked more and more like Santa as his like black hair turned gray as he got older. But yeah, I mean, he looks like a fat old Greek fisherman like Saint Nick. I mean, but by the time I was 7 or 8, I understood that my dad was Santa Claus, but like I wasn't 100% confident my dad wasn't like legit fucking Santa Claus. Like he might be Santa Claus for other people as well. I had seen him be Santa Claus for a lot of homeless kids by that point.
Like Tim Allen, maybe like a little bit, you know, like.
You know, my father definitely explained that like gods weren't real the same way like Jesus wasn't real. But like you shouldn't tell other people that because they'll just get mad or sad. And 2, like that was still like I mean, he didn't use the word egregore when he explained it to an 8-year-old, but he definitely understood like, but there is like a thing made out of people's beliefs that like inspires people to do good things in the world, and that's a good thing. Like that's a thing worth being in the world. So I grew up with that kind of understanding of gods, but I also grew up with the explicit understanding, like the Greek gods that like I read about in mythology. There was like a show on PBS about them when I was a kid. Like those were the gods of my ancestors on my dad's side, just like the god of Israel was the god of my ancestors on my mother's side. Like I grew up with 2 intact cultures in a way that I think many white Americans grow up with no intact culture.
Sure.
And I think that like because there were always two of them, that like made it really easy for me to like both like believe in things but not get stuck in beliefs of things.
Do you feel like you're still in that position, or do you believe in things more now?
I feel like I've gotten better at believing in things that I want to believe in, which is something I really struggled with as a kid because, I don't know, because, you know, growing up interfaithless, you see a lot of hypocrisy surrounding religion, both in your own family, but also much more so in like other people, in a way that like makes it easy to come to the idea that like belief is just stupid and like the opiate of the masses, which is definitely, like, I want to be clear, that was definitely my dad's position on the matter when I was young.
And do you feel like that has influenced you in a positive or a negative way towards your magical life?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think there is pretty much always a benefit to being of hybrid belief, right? Like, I think it gives you a capacity for openness. But I think growing up with a diversity of belief is just good. And I also think that in the same sense, I think that when you grow up in a minority religion, you just don't have the option of not examining the role of religion in the world. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's an amount of privilege to growing up in a majority religion that like I just didn't have, and that made religion like a thing I had to learn about because otherwise people threw rocks at me.
Well, and obviously, if your religion is somewhat worth preserving, and that the dominant religion is somewhat worth preserving, then both have some value and be able to live together, right? So it gives you sort of a natural good feeling towards stuff, so potentially, or the opposite.
I will say that as a kid, my experience of Christianity was uniformly hateful and sometimes violent.
You felt that way, or they felt that way towards you?
My experience of what Christianity was in the world was that it hated me, sometimes violently. So like I guess, like, this is, I mean, I'm speaking as like my 7-year-old self here. I'm not saying I still believe this, but certainly at the time, no, I did not think it was a thing worth preserving. I thought it was hateful and violent and wanted me dead. And I'm not gonna lie, like, part of me still kind of feels that way, although I will say I don't necessarily think that way in my brain, but like, I'm not gonna lie, like, and in truth, I think pretty much everyone who grows up in a minority religion in the United States, like, yeah, I got some like unhealed Christianity PTSD in there.
Sure, yeah.
But I also think that, like, you know, as an effect of that PTSD, it like cracks you open, or not as a result of PTSD, but as a result of that religious trauma, which is a different kind, like, there are other kinds of religious trauma for like people who grow up in cults or like whatever, right? But like, there's a kind of trauma that like it opens you up to growth in ways that I think are much harder when I think for kids who grow up and really only ever hear one point of view, like, it's harder to see what the world is. Just like when we were talking about translations, like, you got to triangulate between them. Like, I definitely understood that like parts of Judaism were stupid, but parts of it were excellent. And I definitely understood that like parts of the ancient Greek religion were stupid, but parts of it were excellent. And I definitely also understood that, like, I guess what we now call the fairy faith, which is reasonable, like the kind that I learned in fairy tales, was also like good. And there was good stuff there, but also a lot of bad stuff there, like a lot of like dangerous superstition and burning witches and whatnot.
Right, yeah. It's being scared of the supernatural.
Yeah. I sort of feel like those three pieces are really kind of like what I landed in.
So how did you move from sort of, you know, alternate religious views and fairy tales to actually kind of the conduct of magic as a practice?
Well, I sort of feel like all toddlers are magicians, and then you beat it out of them. And I just didn't really have it beat out of me. Like, my dad thought it was like silly, I guess. But like, also, I mean, my mom was pretty witchy. Like, she did not appreciate the term witch being applied to her. But she also understood herself to be like a very effective wisher. Like, and she definitely, look, what she taught me is that like, the way she would have said it is that like, God is talking to everybody, but most people just aren't listening.
Okay.
So like, I guess I just sort of always grew up with that, but I have a really clear memory of when I like learned that other people also did this thing and they called it witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was about, I'm gonna say 9-ish, my mostly estranged grandfather sent me a birthday present, but it was not actually my birthday, which was some book, I don't remember. But I also got like a gift certificate to like a mail order book company. Like, I grew up in Amish country, and this story is set in like 1987. So like, these are books I did not have access to. And I was flipping through the catalog, and there under nonfiction was a subheading called witchcraft. And I knew what nonfiction meant. That meant it was real. Witches were real. And I was like, Mom, are witches real? Like in fairy tales? And she very politically said, there are definitely people who think they're witches. And I was like, can I get a book? Can I get a book? And she was like, yeah, but it's not going to be good. I was like, oh,
was it good?
No, I mean, it was fine. It was, I don't even know what this book is actually called, but I call it Bucklands' Big Blue Book of Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo.
I think it might just be called Buckland's Book of Witchcraft. That was definitely one of my first books too.
The big blue one. It's got that was the edition I had as a kid. It was blue, and it was excellent in the sense that it like told me that witchcraft was real and like gave me permission to do it. But I will say, in terms of like actual things I learned from it, most of them were terrible, and I wish I hadn't learned them.
Like, what's some terrible thing you learned from it?
Like, forging your own knife is totally reasonable, but sewing your own robe is probably too hard for you. You should get your wife to do it.
That's it in that book?
I mean, I'm not saying word for word. As a, I don't know, 12-year-old reading that book, that's how it felt to me.
That was the impression you got?
There was a lot in there about... There was a lot of like weird, I guess what we would now call like heteronormative bullshit in that book. I mean, I don't know, like it was fine. It was a fine book. I'm not even saying it's a bad book. Like, you know, it was the 80s. Like, it was probably the best introduction to witchcraft book I could have bought from a mail order catalog in 1987. Like, it's not a bad book.
Probably true.
We just have much better books. But then the next book I got was called The Encyclopedia of White Witchcraft by Patty Slade, which is actually excellent. Like, it goes through the Wheel of the Year. She is like some kind of hereditary British witch in a like mixed British witch coven. So she's got Gardnerians, and she's got like, I don't know, what I guess we would now call British traditional witchcraft. Like, I don't know, it's like in that zone. And I'm not saying it was like, it's not that I learned any particular details in that book. But, and this is in no way a slight on Ray Buckland, I think like the witchcraft that Patty Slade was practicing felt much more like the witchcraft from fairy tales that I was excited about being real than Buckland. Yeah. And a lot of that is just like that book. The Patty Slade book has like really good photos. Like some of it's just like, it's pretty. Like that's a good book for a 14-year-old witch.
I seem to remember when I read Raymond Buckland's book, it felt a little bit like the magic was a little thin. You know, it was more about the.
He did not seem. Here's how I would say it today. Like, do you even magic, bro? That's sort of how I felt when I read this book. I'm like, okay, but there were definitely. I feel like the most important thing I got out of that Buckland book is like witchcraft is real. It is hidden in history. If you look hard, you can find it. And you can do that by just like being smart and thinking things through. That's what I got out of that book, which I found quite useful. Then I just did that.
And so did you begin to practice when you read that book, or was it more of just a literary experience at that point?
I feel like I was sort of already practicing. What I definitely understood, what I really got, I keep saying what I really got out of the book. I got a lot of things out of that book.
Apparently.
Again, I think I would have gotten them sort of from anywhere. I really think mostly I got them from that catalog that put witchcraft in
the catalog that said it's real.
It's real. Okay, I can do this. I know where to find it. Fairy tales have left a very clear path. Also, you know, I didn't learn from fairy tales. I was already learning from like trees. We live
How so?
on this, I don't know, like I definitely learned from fairy tales and also world religions and mythology that if you sat underneath a tree for a long time, you would learn magical wisdom. And that is true. Like, if you sit under a tree for 8 hours, that tree will teach you, and you like open yourself up to the love of a tree and commune with a tree, which when you're 8 is not hard. Like, you will learn things from that tree. And in truth, I was unsupervised a lot as a kid. So like, I sometimes sat under a tree for 8 hours.
So
I don't mean my parents were like neglectful or anything. I just mean it was the 80s and we were allowed to be outside all day.
Your parents are, I'm sure they're fine. They're not worried about it. So you can, but your lack of supervision in the 80s was pretty much standard, I think. So when you sit under a tree though, what do you feel like you're learning? I mean, that you can recall. Like what do you mean by that?
Tree. The first thing you learn is that like there's stuff under the ground. I know that seems silly to not know, but I feel like as humans, you know, we live in the sky. We live in the bottom of the sky, but we live in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Can't really see the stuff that's under the ground. Like I certainly knew that trees had roots, but I didn't like comprehend there was a whole like world down there that was just as complicated as the world up here. So that is one thing I learned from trees is like how to sink those roots. You know what I mean? Like how to gain sensory access, I guess, to the near underworld is technically what I'm saying. But also how to like carefully observe dirt and bugs and just nature and how things work. But also like in a spiritual sense, what it means to like pretend to be a tree. Do you know what I mean? And really energetically feel what it is to like send your roots down, down, right? And send your leaves up. And you just have this like energetic experience, which I guess is called a Kundalini awakening. But when you're 8, I think it's called pretend to be a tree.
Okay, so just because like I mean, you could look at dirt
I haven't really thought about it. I just sort of put that together while I was.
The thing is, you can look at dirt and you can imagine the roots of a tree, but and so those sorts of things. What was the interaction with the tree that made you feel like you were in communion with the tree rather than just sort of going on a mental trip? Was there something that you felt?
Yeah, I mean, like it talked like an imaginary friend because I'm 8 in this story. Normal 8-year-olds do that, right? I'm not crazy like all 8, or not all 8-year-olds, but like many 8-year-olds.
Some do. I mean, my son certainly likes to talk to things and have interesting little mystical experiences. My eldest daughter, a little bit when she was a little younger than that, but she's a little bit more sort of logical and serious about that sort of stuff. And my middle child is very sort of like inquisitive about spirituality, but I don't feel like she's super open to that stuff as much. My son's definitely like in communication with a lot of stuff, including doorknobs and stuff like that too. So
I will say the first like what I would genuinely call like spirit interaction I had is we lived down the street from, it's called a monastery, but like nuns, not monks, live there. But it was called a monastery, which I found confusing. Now you gotta understand, I didn't really know what nuns were, right? Like I grew up Greek, atheist, and Jewish, so like my understanding of nuns was like from TV, where I understood that they like lived in a castle and wore magic robes and like engaged in mystic whatnot all day. No boys were allowed. And that sounded great. No lie, that still sounds great. I am weirdly founding an order of Hecatean nuns, but that's like a whole other thing. But
you are doing that right now? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm totally doing that right now. If people want to look into it, it's crocopeplos.org. But it's very still in the, I wasn't actually planning to launch it yet, so like you'll find you're reading a page and just cuts out halfway through the page because I started very, very
information. But this is going to sit on the internet forever. But so you're sure that this is something you're doing?
I mean, I'm definitely doing it. Like I can't promise that I will still be doing it in a decade, but like I'm definitely doing it.
But maybe someone will be doing it then.
I mean, if anybody does it with like if there are 2 people in the world who will do it with me, then I will commit to doing it. Like, I'm pretty serious about this. I've been working on it for a long time.
So anyway, a Hecate nun system.
It's not exactly Hecate. It's a goddess I call the goddess of the Crocopeplos, which means like the, you know, the golden robe, the saffron robe. But contextually usually means like the moon or sometimes another celestial body, like shining through clouds, and it has this amber aura.
Okay.
So, like, you know, clouds in front of the sun, they obscure light, but when they're in front of the moon in the dark, they like illuminate more of the darkness than you would otherwise see, like the whole aura around it. So it's that goddess, of whom Hecate is definitely like one name for that thing, but Hecate is also other things, and also there are other, like Artemis is also a goddess of the crowd.
So your first mystical experience, though, or magical experience?
I stuck into the nun's garden, and they had like a Mary statue that was like decorated with flower garlands. Like, I'd read enough fairy tales to know a fairy queen when I saw one. And so I don't know, she and I got to know each other.
Again, verbal communication with her, or just sort of spiritual?
Like, it was in words, but it's not like, I definitely like knew that those words were in my mind and not coming in my ears. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like I heard a voice that I confused for a like real world voice. But also I was 8, so like my imagination is pretty compelling, and I don't necessarily have the same, you know, as I grew older, it became pretty clear that I was insane for hearing those things and I should not be hearing them. And that was unpleasant. But at this young age, I haven't really, like, I'm still allowed to hear those things.
Sure.
And it's not like it's a little, the other kids would make fun of me for it because it was like babyish, but not because I was insane.
When did it become insane?
I mean, slowly over time.
It's not insane now, though, right? You're not.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, I will definitely go so far as to say, like, I think it's probably true that my neurological processes are like not fully typical. I mean,
whose are?
Insane. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily believe in normal people, but like, I definitely think like my brain is perhaps different than other people's brains, but I don't know, like, between you and me, at most brain stuff, I'm better than most people at it. So like, I'm okay with that. It's not insane. Like, you know, as I got older, it became clear to me that insanity was about an inability to function in the world. And once I understood that, like, then I wasn't afraid of being crazy anymore. But like, it's pretty scary to think you're crazy because you can't really tell anybody, because then you're definitely crazy. So, you know, there's a rough patch, which I assume all witchy people go through.
So at what point did you start like connecting with other people about witchcraft and magic?
Pretty much right away. So my BFF when I was a little girl was named Megan. And she was not like explicitly into witchcraft, but she was also like into mythology. She was also like had one Jewish parent and one not Jewish parent. We met in Girl Scouts. And she was super into like the paranormal. So like those two wound together really well. So like I was always the one pushing like the witchier part, and she was always the one pushing the like paranormal part. But like we were in agreement that those things were both awesome. And so I had a co-magician pretty much right away.
So by paranormal, do you mean like she was looking for alien spaceships, or was she was looking for psychic powers? What was she really interested in?
She and a non-trivial amount of psychism runs in her family, as it does in mine, but perhaps a little stronger in her. And like she was very interested in the like, I would say, gray area between like psychic stuff and other kinds of like psychology. Like she was very interested in the ways brains work and also kind of psychic. So and she was also super interested in plants. So like she's a naturopath now. So like she's super into plants. Like she was a biochemist for a while, like her specialty is phytochemistry. So like I always had a co-magician, and I also always had a co-magician that was like different enough from me that we were both used to just like translating. Do you know what I mean? Like it was clear to us that like we weren't necessarily doing this thing in the same way, but they both worked, and they worked much better together than either of them did separately. So it was worth like understanding how other people did things. And I think that was invaluable.
So were you guys doing rituals together, or just sort of talking about what you were like, in what way were you working together?
Okay, so the first like ritual I remembered, the first kinds of rituals we did are the rituals that like all young girls at our time did, right? So like Ouija boards and light as a feather, stiff as a board. And like, I did not know until I was teaching high school that other people do not talk to ghosts when they play with a Ouija board. Because when I used a Ouija board, there was a ghost that talked, and that's what was supposed to happen. And I definitely, I understood it didn't happen to everybody, because I sometimes played Ouija boards with other people and they got freaked out when like light bulbs popped, or like, I have never seen a planchette move on a board with nobody's hand on it, but I have definitely felt a planchette like grab out of my hand. I am convinced, I will say today, I feel like Ouija boards are like maybe the hardest way to talk to the dead. It's like much easier to just talk to them. But like, I don't know, they worked, and TV told me they were gonna work, so I didn't know that was strange. So it like, there was a smooth transition from like that into more formal ritual that like we were making out of those Buckland rituals, right? So we definitely understood from Buckland that to do a ritual, you like made a circle and you had a candle for your male god and a candle for your female god, and you had to pick one. And so I picked Hecate and Hermes, and I gotta say, they have not done wrong by me. I stand by that choice.
Good choices.
I mean, I have other ones, but you know, like I grew up with a lot of Greek mythology. Like those were the gods of my ancestors. Like that was an important cultural transmission that I was into, but for example, my brother was not into, but it wasn't fully optional. Like he also knows all the Olympians despite not caring even a little. So you had these, you had a lord and a lady, and then you had a candle that like represented your intent. And then you like raised some energy, which like two teenage girls, not that hard, right? And then you like chanted. So the first one I remember was for snow. So let me think. We're trying to get out of a trig midterm. She and I are both in advanced math. That's one of the reasons she and I are super tight. She and I were both a year ahead in math, which meant we had the exact same schedule all day long in school. So we're trying to get out of a trig midterm, so we really want it to snow. And like, it's February in Pennsylvania. It's not like outside the realm of possibility it's gonna snow. But we're not necessarily expecting snow, although like young folks, weather prediction did not used to be what it is now. Like, it was pretty iffy. And so we prayed for snow, and so we set up our candles. We found a snowflake-shaped candle in my mom's, I don't know, pantry cupboard where she kept junk that people gave her at Christmas time that she didn't want, and like some other things. And we set it all up. And then we just like imagined snow really hard. We lit the candles and we like danced around like crazy teenage girls in a circle doing our witchy Sabbath devil worship dance. I mean, which I personally feel like all 14-year-old girls know how to crazy devil worship circle dance. It's just innate, right? And we did that for a while, and then it was dinner time, so we went downstairs and ate dinner, and then we watched Star Trek together, and there still wasn't any snow, and she went home, and we woke up the next day, and there was like 1.5 feet of snow, and it didn't stop snowing for a week.
Well, that's a good conclusion, I guess.
Yeah. So we were like, oh yeah, let's do more of this.
So how did the Orphic hymns start coming into this for you? How late in the game did that happen?
Well, I don't specifically recall my father reading me the Orphic hymns, but I imagine that he did. Right? I probably grew up with it. Like, I'm sure the Taylor Orphic hymns were in our house because we were Greek, and you should be proud to be Greek. We invented civilization, Sarah. So like those were in my house. So I knew the Greek gods from a kid, but I don't have any specific recollection of like that book in comparison to the Homeric hymns, which I'm sure I also read. It's like I read basically, by the time I was in high school, I think I'd read most of what we would consider the classics. Like I was into that kind of thing, and those books were easy to find, and there wasn't an internet, so we didn't have a TV for a long time. There wasn't that much to do in my house, so I read a lot of books. So, but then, when I do magic in front of other people, I want like fancy words to say, right? So I started to rely more and more on Orphic hymns and Taylor's Orphic hymns, but like some of them just didn't feel right. I was like, it seems like something a British neoclassicist would say, and not like something Orpheus would say. And so I started to dig into them, and like other translations were available, and I don't know, it kind of snowballed from there. And then Mnemosynes, Selene, I think is the first one I translated.
Interesting.
Because I just didn't like Taylor's translation.
One of the things that's interesting about your book is that you have some fairly daunting ritual suggestions right at the beginning of the book that involve both going through every single one of the hymns and then also going through a like 36-week program or something where you're going through these.
A day. It's not that long.
Oh, a day. Yeah, sorry. And in that one, you suggest an interesting way of getting into an altered state of consciousness, which is beginning as a bull and ending as a snake. Is that correct? How do you I read it, but how do you make that sound in actuality?
Oh.
And you and you say that that's going to produce an altered state of consciousness. What kind of altered state of consciousness do you expect that to produce with the repeated use of it?
Well, to start off with, there's like an amount of lightheadedness because it's like a difficult way to breathe. Like there's a lightheadedness just from the breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And then at least for me, there's a real, sorry, I'm moving my hands as if that's conveying something. There is I guess what I would call a circulation of the body of the light very fast, right? Like not individual, whatever we call them, chakras, I guess, spinning, but like the whole thing spinning. And then
how many times do you have to do that chant, that before it happens?
Till it works? I don't know. I have to do it 10 times. I'm not usually counting, but I do a lot of like breath be trance work, and also that breath trance work was written specifically for me. Other people I've seen do it the first time takes a little longer, but it's pretty reliable.
And is that something that you do all the time, or is that something just for that ritual?
No, it's something for that ritual in particular. So the reason that ritual was at the beginning of the book, because I agree with you, like my natural instinct would be to put that at the end. Like you've already done this whole book. If you're still here, here's some more to do.
Right.
But, the first of the Orphic hymns, the hymn to Musaeus, is like definitely different than the other hymns in a lot of different ways. Like the language is different, but also it's not a hymn to a specific god, right? It's a hymn to like a whole litany of gods, right? I would understand that to be like the first one you learn. Like if you do that, you can perform at a festival, you're good to go, right? But there's no, and it's clearly like, there's a bumper at the beginning that says basically like, Dear Musaeus, this is the best spell ever. Better than everything else. Like, and Musaeus is, sometimes a person. Like Musaeus is sometimes the teacher of Orpheus, sometimes the son of Orpheus. Some people say it's the same person as Moses. Like he's one of the great bards of ancient Greece, along with like Orpheus and Homer and Hesiod, right? Getting like more historical as we go forward. But Musaeus, as I understand it, is actually just like a title that means like the person, the muse touched one. Right. So to me, like that is clearly like an initiatory text. Like this is how you become muse touched.
Muse touched. Yeah.
But there's no like instructions for it. So I just sort of like generated some instructions for it based on, other contemporary sources. So there's a lot of PGM bits in there, and it, experimentation, right? Like I got an Orphic initiation by translating and working through Orphic hymns a lot, right? Like. But then I thought, like, well, now that I'm there, let me see if I can jailbreak it a little into this ritual, right? So I'm in no way claiming that that is a reconstruction of an ancient ritual. I am saying, like, I believe that the completion of this ritual does, in fact, like, whatever we call that in our culture, like, open the gates of poetry in you. Like, put you in.
And that specifically the bull snake portion of it, is that something that
came out of a PGM ritual, which is titled something like, I'm sorry, I don't remember quite off the top of my head. Like, it's cited.
Don't worry about it. It's in the PGM, folks. Look it up.
PGM, and it's called like the initiation of the great teacher Orpheus or something. Like,
okay.
Expressly this.
So, what other forms of altered state practices do you utilize to move into, you know, sort of ritual space?
Honestly, my most reliable one is still pretend to be a tree.
Oh, okay.
You go down, 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 down. You sink your roots until you get to like, I don't know, until you run out of down to a place that I would call like the womb of the earth. And there's like some like wet, gooey, delicious, like green blue energy that comes up you, and you like up your roots, and then you go up, and you like fountain out the top of your head, and you have like willow branches, and then you do that a bunch of times.
And so I want to ask you a couple of questions that I ask most people, like, and then we can get a little bit more into your sort of ritual technology. What are these spirits and gods to you? What is it? Because you mentioned earlier on that you know, you were sort of taught that they were, you know, Santa Claus and Jesus and Zeus. They're all kind of, you know, this sort of made up thing. So what do they mean to you today?
So that's a really complicated question that I will try and keep my answer too short. So a spirit is something that can communicate with you. You are a spirit. I am a spirit. We are spiriting together. If it can talk to me, like if I can reliably engage in communication with it, it's a spirit. That's what I mean by spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Whether it has a body or not, whether it, as sort of a matter of faith, I would say that it does have a name, but whether it claims to have a name that it will tell me or not. A god, this is complicated. I was just this afternoon, like I wrote a 3-page essay on what a god is. But the short answer is that, like, you know, etymologically, the roots of the English word god are like something that you pour libations for. Like that's what a god is. Like, I think when we use these terms, it's important to understand they're not like ontological species racial categories. We're categorizing a relationship that is occurring with a human being, right? So my god might be your devil. In fact, many people in the world have told me that my gods are their devil.
Right.
But broadly, my favorite definition of god is one I'm just shamelessly stealing from Ian Corrigan, and that is that a god is a spirit who can be relied upon to reward your worship with blessing.
With what?
With blessing. With
blessings.
Yeah, like if you worship them, your life should get better.
And if you worship them, your life gets worse, then they're not a god?
You know, I think God only makes sense in relationships. So they're not your God. Maybe they're somebody's God. You know, like I think God makes sense when it's the God of sailors or the God of Israel or like the God of that cave right there or my God. But I don't necessarily know that God as a like term that's not related to a human relating to it necessarily makes a lot of sense.
But so when you're talking to a spirit and a spirit is talking to you, what is that relationship in actuality that's happening there?
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay. I'm speaking sort of you know, metaphysical concepts that are sort of thrown around in the magical community. You know, some people view them as being sort of a personification of psychological complexes that may somehow connect you to higher forces, or some people look at them as being you know, unique entities that have been, you know, in existence since the creation of the world, or that, you know, grow out of various things that are related to the creation of the world. And, you know, there's just all kinds of different ways of looking at it. So what's your way of looking at it?
I think my way is sort of frustratingly a like yes and no but. Like you and I are spirits engaged in communication. I know that I'm me and you're you because I'm inside my skin and you're inside your skin, and those things are in different places, right? Like for embodied spirits, like the body creates a clear boundary, and you know, sometimes less clear than others, right? So like a genius loci is also an embodied spirit, but its boundaries are not as clean as like a skin vessel, right? But you know, things that don't have bodies, they're not as cleanly separate as we are, right? So when you say like they're individual unique spirits, I mean, like they are, but also, are they though? I mean, you and I are different, but also, like, sure, there is some level at which we are participating in the same, like, oneness of experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's the same for spirits. So, in truth, I'm not gonna lie, it's not that I'm not invested in answering those kinds of metaphysical questions. It's truthfully that I think, like, the world is weird and difficult to explain, and, like, any kind of explanation I can give to that question that is like 2 sentences long is probably ridiculous. So, like, Artemis of Ephesus and Artemis of Eleusis, are they the same spirit? Well, I would have thought so until I was in those 2 places. But they, even if you've never been to those places, even if you just, like, read the 2 Wikipedia articles, you know what? If somebody hadn't told you those were both named Artemis, you would not have known those were the same goddess. Whereas, like, Artemis of Eleusis and Hecate of Eleusis are identical. Identical. Like, that is humans giving different names to the same thing. Right?
If there weren't humans, though, would there be an Artemis of Eleusis or any other Artemis?
So I think so. I broadly sort of categorize gods into 2 categories, but I will say that, like, in my actual practice, the gods I am working with are actually, like, complicated combinations of these 2 things, right? But there's things I call elder gods. Those are gods that are gods of things that pre-exist humans. Bear. Bear is an elder god. Bear is a bear. He was a bear before there were humans. He is still a bear. Do human beliefs about bear move bear? Like, capital B bear? Like, maybe a little, but not that much, because bear really only gives a shit about bears. Right? So, like, humans have, you know, changed genetically and, like, evolutionarily what bears are. Like, we've, you know, genocided certain kinds of bears. But that's an elder god, right? The god of Father Ohio, who is the river near my house. There are a lot of rivers near my house. One of the rivers near my house. Like, that is an elder god. Father Ohio was there before humans got there. He will continue to be there after. Like, we gave him a name. We've given him many, many, many names over time. And, like, we have opinions about him. And, like, human history informs him. Like, the fact that, okay, if you close your eyes and, like, imagine a scene of a slave fleeing across a river to, like, an American slave fleeing across a river to freedom, the river you are picturing, I guarantee you, is the Ohio. That's the river where Abraham Lincoln first met an enslaved person, right? When, in the phrase "sold down the river," that's the river they're talking about. So, like, those human actions on Father Ohio, they mean something, right? Like, they give Ohio this mythic character that, like, associates it with the River Jordan in a lot of ways. Like, the American, if you close your eyes and imagine, like, a preacher giving people baptisms in a river, that's also the Ohio River in that picture, like, in a historical context. And so, like, those elder gods, you know, humans move them a little, but at the end of the day, like, that's just what the Ohio River is, and it's that way independent of humans, right? So we have these elder gods, the god of light, Zeus lightning hurler, like Zeus in his aspect that is the lightning, Zeus of Mount Olympus, the Zeus that is that mountain. Those are elder gods, but then we also have these new gods, which are, like, gods of human things. Like, they're gods that are formed out of things human did. Athena Polias, right? Like, the goddess of the city. That's a new god. Like, we made that.
And but okay,
right?
so if we're capable of making gods, though, then, you know, what is it? What distinguishes the elder god from the new god? Is does it have the same existence, or is that more of just a human thing?
I mean, I really only can see them from my human point of view, so I don't know what they're like when we're not around. I'm always a human. Like, my every interaction with anything is always from that human point of view. In a sort of, like, technical sense, the elder gods are much harder to move and much easier to learn. Like, they are just, or harder, right? So, like, but they're, like, a lot of times people come to me and they'll be like, I have this spirit relationship with lion. How can I get to know it better? And I'll be like, well, have you gone to the zoo and just watched lions a lot? And shockingly, many of them are like, oh my God, that's such a good idea. Like they had not thought of that. But like those elder gods, like they're just there. They exist in a like, they have a reality and a like way to interact with humans that is immediate because they're older than us. Like we grew up in their shadow. They formed us. Like they were here first and they formed us. Right? Whereas the new gods, you can move them. Right? Like Bear, in order to move where Bear is, we had to like murder all the cave bears and stuff. You know what I mean? We had to really, like, it was a lot of work. I'm not saying we did that on purpose. I'm saying, but like humans did do that, right? Whereas like to move Athena Pelias, right? Or Hermes of the Crossroads. Like crossroads are another, like, that's a human invention, right? They don't really exist without humans. Like there's a kind of a way they do the path to the river and the elk path, like maybe, but like, you know, there's an immediacy to that communication aspect that like humans who live in giant bands of like 100, but have this like complex social relationship, like there's a kind of communication that is a human thing. And that I think is at the core of say who Hermes is. But that god's movable because it's just not that old, and it's not that its physical instantiation in the world comes through human hands. Like the temple, like Bear doesn't need a human to build a temple for it. It already has temples in the world. Like the forest is already its temple. Like nature already built one for it. But these human ones, like they kind of need us to do stuff for them. And so they are a little more like movable. Do you know what I mean? Like a skilled storyteller can with a story change who that god is. And you can't change him too far, but you can nudge him a little. You can nudge him a little, just like any other kind of like social construct.
Okay, but so you communicate with the gods and you feel that the gods communicate back with you.
Not all of them, but yeah.
Who are you communicating when you're communicating with a god? Like what's happening?
I generally understand that I am not usually communicating directly with a god, although I think occasionally that does happen. I think in sort of a technical sense, probably what is happening is I am talking with like a familiar spirit of that god's court. The same way that like if I call McDonald's on the phone, I don't necessarily expect to be talking to Ronald McDonald, but I do expect to be talking to somebody who is like, at least in as much as they are talking, authorized to speak on behalf of McDonald, like a familiar / employee of that spirit.
Okay, I think that's a fair
relationship. You kind of get one of your own. Like you have your own customer service rep. You're not just calling the main hotline.
And so, you know, obviously, the first time that you interact with any kind of being like that, you don't have your own personal representative necessarily.
I really advocate that the best way to get to know spirits is with an introduction, right? So like the first time you interact with a spirit, in my opinion, the best way to do that is with somebody, like another human standing next to you who does have a direct mind. Like I really think that, like, honestly, I really genuinely believe that in today's connected world, like magicians who say they can't get initiations are just not trying very hard.
Sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if somebody wants to meet Hecate, I think there are a lot of people who can help them do that and are willing to help them do that.
So when you're wanting to connect with Hecate or perhaps a deity that you're less familiar with, what's the actual process that you utilize to do so?
It really depends on the context, right? Dark mirror evocation is a favorite of mine. That's one of the first methods I learned. I really like automatic writing. That's probably the first way I learned that, like, I don't know how to say, I could like kind of push it. Like I could take a call from a tree, but I didn't really know how to place a call. Like if that tree wanted to talk to me, I was there and listening, but I didn't really know how to do it. But automatic writing taught me a lot. And I think a lot of what it does is, just like when you're dreaming, like things flip through your head really fast, and it's just hard to keep track of them. But once you can force it to come out in automatic writing, like it slows the process down and like forces it. you know, in like Solomonic invocations where they're like, I command you to speak proper English like the queen. Ta-da! I understand that's not exactly how it goes.
Pretty close.
Yeah, like I command you to appear comely and with a fashionable tongue. I don't know. It's like some junk. I haven't done Solomonic invocation in a long time. I'm not really a fan of it. I haven't done like medieval grimoire style Solomonic invocation. But, you know, but I got that idea from them. I was like, oh, I can just ask them to talk in English. Which again, you know, I didn't know trees could talk English until I like read the Keys of Solomon. I was like, oh, well, I didn't know you could make a demon speak English. I thought I was gonna have to learn to speak demon. This is definitely easier. So like automatic writing, you can force them to speak English, basically. Like, and that slows it down. And so that eases that. And I guess I learned that from Aosphere, really. Automatic writing. So that's a technique I use a lot. I do a lot of like trance descent work. I guess we call that.
What
like,
is that? What does that look like?
Now, I mean, you know, you like induce a trance and then you like leave your body and go down to the underworld and like hook up with a guide and then they facilitate some communication, basically. Yeah, I guess those are the ways I do it mostly.
And so
I know I do a lot of different things depending on different contexts. If I was trying to establish contact with a spirit that I didn't have a like connection to, right? Like I couldn't find a person and I also didn't have like a spirit to introduce me, because you can also go recently I was doing political magic with some friends and I'm like the channel in our circle. It's like when somebody wants to talk to a god, they're usually going through me to do it. And somebody wanted to talk to Apollo, who, as I mentioned before, is not necessarily like my strong suit. Sure. And I like couldn't make a connection. And finally I was like, oh, but I know your sister really well. I was like, oh, and then I just asked Artemis, and then he showed up immediately. Like that bounced the connection, right? So that's actually in my practice usually what I'm doing. Like usually I'm making connection with a spirit I already do know, right? Sometimes like I guess we call that a holy guardian angel. I'm a little skeptical about that. I'm just going to call all of those kinds of spirits familiar spirits, like the ones that are familiar to me. You know, usually I would go through one of them to make contact with somebody else, or I would get an introduction from a human. But if for some reason I couldn't do that, like I try and basically like build a bubble of their native habitat, right? So whatever I do know about them, I'm going to like cast a circle, which is not really intended to keep them in so much as it is to just like make a bubble where they can live, right? And I'll try and fill it up with whatever I do know about them. Maybe I know there's some colors, maybe I know like an incense, like whatever it is I do know about them, which might just be like a vague description, right? And I try and like build them a little habitat. And you know, even if I don't know them very well, I have some opinions about like, well, this is a river spirit. I have some understanding about what river spirits like. I'm just gonna like make them a little dragon. It'll be wet. It'll be fine. They'll like it, right? And then I'm just gonna call them like as well as I can, right? So if I have a name, I'm just gonna repeat it until they take my call. I might eventually like. It is a rare occasion where I will compel. I don't know that I would ever compulsively summon a spirit. Like I will compel spirits that are already there, who are like in my business. But I don't know. It's hard for me to conjecture a circumstance where I would force a spirit that didn't want to talk to me. So like I don't really think of it as summoning so much as like creating an environment for them and then like knocking on the door until they answer me, or don't. Like if they don't answer, they don't answer.
And where do verbal invocations and the Orphic hymns, for instance, fit in with that?
So at this point, the Orphic hymns are all like spirits that I know, right? And also for other people, right? Like most of the spirits of the Orphic hymns are like easily accessible in our world. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of ways to get in touch with them, right? Like there's just well understood things to do to get in touch with them. But for ones that there aren't, you know, a lot of times I will construct a ritual that is similar to one I already know. I mean, I like, you know, I make a verbal invocation because I like words, right? But like Brian, I was talking about my illustrator BFF, he would definitely draw a picture of them instead. Do you know what I mean? Like you just kind of do whatever you're good at to like kind of butter them up. And I feel like for me, there's kind of a formula that I make, like I pre-write those, right? So usually I will pre-write like a pretty invitation. And then after that, I'll just speak from the heart and like explain why I want to talk to them. But for me, like you start off with whatever you do know about them, some names. I got in, I think for all of us magicians who started young, there's like some piece of fiction that like imprinted on us what a magician is. And for me, it was Ursula Le Guin, like the magic of names. Like you list names for them and you have to be careful. Even when I was very young, I would read a lot of these, I'm just going to call it 80s neopaganism invocations that would be like a list of goddess names that were like clearly not the same goddess. Like I'm willing to come down on the idea that like some goddesses are close to being, right? Hecate, Artemis, Diana, Aradia, okay. Like they're enough in the same category. Like you can call kind of all of them at once and get kind of a thing there, right? But like you can't call Hera and Hecate and Sedna of the cold ocean. Like you can't just randomly call goddesses all at once. Like, like your list of names, it has to be like coherently the same thing. Right? But like names and titles for person, little snippets of their mythology, which are often called historiola. And then I'm going to like introduce myself. Like, here's who I am and, blah, 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 why you should care. Right? So I'm talking to Apollo, I'll be like, I'm Sara Mastros, I'm an initiate of your sister Artemis. Like, I'm an initiate of your mother Leto. Right? And then like what I want. You know what I mean? And then usually some follow-up of like kind of I'm gonna propose a little bit of a deal, but I'm broadly not a like compact on a first date kind of a girl. Like usually the first time I make contact with spirit, I don't necessarily want anything. I just kind of want to get to know them better.
So you don't think it's a good idea to try and obligate or yourself or the being that you're speaking to on the first occasion?
I wouldn't, just like I wouldn't usually with a person make a deal the very first time. But it would depend on, the circumstances, but just like with a human being, I wouldn't usually do that.
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. So once you actually make contact with a being, what is that contact like? Is there, do you see them?
First time, it's usually automatic writing.
Okay, so you're just writing things that are coming through. And is there a sense that something's being told to you through that, or is it just your hand doing the motion?
It goes from one to the other. So in the beginning, I'm going to start off. Remember, I said like pre-write a script. I'm going to start with that, and then if I haven't I don't know how to say you kind of feel it when you get like filled up with the spirit. You know what I mean? Like, so what kind
of a feeling is that for you?
So it depends on the kind of a spirit, but usually there is like a tingly crawling up the back of my neck, and then there's like an uncanny like belly roll kind of thing where something in your gut goes like, oh, what? Is the universe like this now? I mean, I know I'm a magician and I do this all the time, but this is still really weird because I feel like for me, it's still weird every time. Like every time the magic actually works, which at this point, it like usually reliably does, I'm still like, there is still a moment of like wonder and awe. The same way that when I was 8, I was like, holy shit, witches are real every time. Do you know what I mean? Like there's just this feeling like, oh yeah, I remember this.
And so this sort of an ecstasy, to use the word freely, comes over you, and then and at that point, is something being communicated to you, or is it just the hand is being taken over?
It depends. Usually kind of in between. I will say like the better I've gotten at it, the better I am at like I can be here and they can be here. So like I can ask a question and my hand will answer it. But you know, when it's not just the hand. Like I can definitely, it's not exact. You know when you get a song stuck in your head? It's not like you think that song is playing in the room, like you know it's only in your head, but it's still like there, like you can hear it, and it's not your voice doing the talking. It's like that.
And over time, does that change, or is automatic writing the main way that you communicate with spirits in general?
Automatic writing is the way I usually communicate with new spirits. Because it provides a little bit of a buffer. Like it's really easy to safe word out of by just like dropping a pen. Like there's no, it's just easy. I like it. It's got enough of a buffer that I don't feel like I'm gonna get sucked in or like I'm gonna get the whole way possessed. Neither of which I necessarily want to do on a first date. But a lot of times I am just getting, like if I have an audience, I will just get possessed on a first date. Like if there's another magician in the room who I trust, like could intervene if things went sideways, which has never happened. I have never needed somebody else to be like, hey, Sarah, like I've never needed somebody else to depossess me. But it's nice to know it's there if I'm gonna need it. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
So that, if there's another magician there, which in my life, you know, especially in my non-COVID life, they're like pretty much is on demand. But like in COVID times, I mean, I can reliably arrange for that.
So what is the context in which this automatic writing is taking place? Because I mean, I can visualize you in a fully dressed temple with the candles, and you're wearing robes, or I can also picture you just sort of sitting in an armchair doing it. Where's the reality of
in between, right? Like there's definitely an attempt to like distance myself from the mundane world. I like to wear a headscarf when I work because it creates a tunnel vision. You know what I mean? Like a lot of my like initial techniques are pulled out of Judaism, right? So a lot of times I'm going to pull up a headscarf that like limits my field of vision and do some rocking back and forth and maybe a little chanting to like, I don't know, get in the mood. I probably turned down most of the lights. A lot of times I really like headphones with not straight up white noise, but like a moving white noise, like a rain noise. In fact, here, my very favorite website for this is called mynoise.net. They have like millions of rain and whatever. My actual favorite trance noise is I have a giant metal mixing bowl, which I put in the dishwasher, and it makes like a crazy like steel drum in the rain noise. I said this once on Facebook, and my aunt was like, oh yeah, your mom used to put you to sleep with the dishwasher noise.
Oh wow, that's funny.
So I actually quite like that noise. And I only recently got a dishwasher. Like I haven't had one for a long time. So I like that noise. But just like I'm not very visual, right? But just like, you can look into clouds and see figures in them, or like scry and smoke. The white noise does the same thing for like hearing, right? So if you just listen to it for a while, just the same way you would like with an open and relaxed mind stare into the clouds to see things, like you start to hear things in it. So sometimes dishwasher, sometimes headphones, sometimes just like natural noise is best. And I live in Pittsburgh, so rain noise is not that hard to come by. Also train behind me, like I have a lot of noises to listen to. So sometimes voices will come out of that, right? But that's a little, it's harder than automatic writing in the sense like it is more exhausting for me and also less reliable, but it does give like a better and deeper connection.
Which does? I'm not following you.
The listening to me. Remember why I liked the automatic writing because it was more buffered? That's really what I'm saying. Like,
so you don't listen to the white noise when you're doing automatic writing, or are those two separate things, or are they the same?
I haven't, but maybe I will. No,
You've
I
also
do not.
mentioned...
Sometimes sometimes I'll play white noise to just like tune out, like if there's other noise around me, right? Like I have neighbors and roommates and stuff, right? I guess I sometimes use them together, but no, usually they are separate.
You also mentioned
if I'm automatic writing, I like don't want to get too deep into trance. Like I'm actually fading a little, right? Whereas like if I want to go deep, it's because I feel a little safer. I know the spirit I'm working with, or I'm in my own house where I like feel pretty protected. Like my bouncer spirits are around, or I have like, if I'm gonna do somebody dangerous on a full, like if I'm gonna do a full possession of somebody I don't know who like maybe has a reputation for not being nice, that's when I definitely want a partner in the room.
you mentioned black mirror scrying as well, but you mentioned you're not very visual. So how do you utilize that?
You know, in truth, like I usually end up closing my eyes partway into it anyway. I think I just like that was like the first, you know, what's that book called? The Poke Runyon one where he does like, do you know what I'm talking about? I think it's just called like Spirits of Magic or something.
Okay, sure.
Poke Runyon has a book about like dark mirror evocation that I read quite early. So I think it would be more accurate to say that I started off with a dark mirror evocation, but like not that visual. So even with a big cloud of smoke to scry in, which is easier than a mirror, like the way I do it, you have the mirror and then like a little candle, so you get a little bit of flickering light, and then incense, and then you. So you're like looking through the incense, through the flicker, into your own reflection, and it like, you know, between you and me, like it kind of turns into another spirit, but in truth, I just close my eyes and listen. Even though it's a mirror.
And then it keeps going, and you just do it in the way that you're comfortable with. But you did try and work with the Bloody Mary sort of like stare at your own image kind of version of that, where you are.
Yeah, I have honestly never had any success with that whatsoever, even on hallucinogens.
Even on what?
Hallucinogens. I mean, like I can see my face doing weird things, like
but it doesn't feel like it can.
Weird fractal patterns on my face. I think partly I'm so non-visual that like really every time I look in a mirror, or now in Zoom, I'm like, oh, is that what I look like? It doesn't somehow, I couldn't really explain to you what I look like in my head, but it's not really this.
Yeah, I actually think I know exactly what you mean. That, you know, looking at yourself is sometimes a surprise. Wow, that's the being that I'm in? Huh. You looking at your snake?
Yeah, he's like, he's just weird right now. It's fine.
So, in doing practical magic activities, which I know you do a lot of as well, how is this? Well, actually, before I even ask this question, you mentioned doing a lot of this in spaces with other people. Are you doing a lot of public work where you're like sitting and people are asking questions of entities? Is that how you're?
When there wasn't a plague in the land, yes.
Right.
Like that was, I would say, like one of the core things we do in my circle, right?
Mm.
Like we kind of pass it around, but I perhaps have more experience than other people I'm working with. So like I'm usually taking the hard ones, basically, but other people as well, right? So we'll like do like a devotional ritual. Like here's how my coven rituals work, basically.
Okay.
There's like a devotional piece at the beginning. There's like a bonding piece between us. You open a portal in the cauldron and you like throw some wishes in. And then sometimes you pull some stuff out, and then somebody gets possessed and gives prophecy from that spirit. Like that's broadly how they all work. So, and that person is usually me, but I'm trying to make other people do
it. And so this is something that it's just within your private group that you're working. You aren't like doing it in
public sometimes at like festivals and stuff.
Oh, okay. So in doing practical work, how does that differ for you from just doing sort of like standard visionary work, or are they all the same thing?
I mean, a lot of times in practical work, the problem is getting the magic like from me to the place in the world it needs to be. Right? Like that's how I feel like they differ. Like the visionary work, like it's just in me.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just like explain it with my regular human powers, right? Whereas like practical magic, I need to push it somewhere else, right? So, it depends on the context. Like I will sometimes like sort of encapsulate the magic into a physical object, basically, and then send that to somebody with instructions, like pretty detailed, like do this, do this, do this. Sometimes like a recorded, like whatever we call that, guided meditation, path working, whatever, like guided instructions for what to do with that thing, right? But I've sort of preloaded it, and they just need to trigger it where they are, right? But sometimes I need to target somebody who, like, for whatever reason, that's not an option, so you know, like hop your way through a photo or what, like that's where I feel like the witchy part, like the sorcery part really comes in, is the getting from the sorcerer to the like effect out in the world, like the action at a distance part. And
do your spirit contacts help with that, or is that something that's just sort of more automatic? I mean, because there's kind of like two different ways that people approach that.
It depends on the thing, right? If the thing I'm trying to impact is like psychological, like I want to make another person think or feel a certain thing. Like say I want to like sweeten the person I'm about to go on a job interview with on me, right? For that, a lot of times I will just sort of like get a spirit to kind of do it. Do you know what I mean? Like I need enough of a connection to the person that I can be like, see this picture? This person right here, here's their name, here's a little map to where they are, here's a photo of their house that I got from Google Maps. Like, you know, the internet is a real boon. Like when people tell me they can't get a material, like a good link to somebody, like, I don't know, are you trying? Because you should be able to get a like a live video feed of most people,
right?
At this point, like it's not that hard to get a connection, an open phone line, like whatever, some kind of connection to the person, and you just be like, hey spirit, go do that, right? But if you need like a more physical result, I feel like you need to get that magic like into the physical somehow. And that's when I want to like put it physically in stuff and physically move it to a physical location, and ideally maybe make them eat it or get it physically in them in some way, or whatever the thing is I'm trying to, like, I will neither confirm nor deny that I have driven a lot of iron railroad spikes around the steel mill down the street from me because they are trying to frack, and I would like them to not do that. And perhaps they have been tied up in bureaucratic nonsense for years at this point, which I am not saying I did any of that.
You can neither confirm nor deny.
As an example, say one wanted to nail down a piece of land so that it could not be fracked on. Perhaps one might do that by enchanting railroad spikes with the blood of the martyrs of the Homestead uprising, and then pound them into the ground at the last remaining Carnegie steel mill. Hypothetically.
It's something that someone could think about.
Stuff that I am putting in the physical place I want it to do.
Got it.
Miller says that astral magic gets astral results, and that's really what I'm saying. Like, I think you need that physical component to get a physical result.
Fair enough. But you don't involve spirit, specific spirits in that to enchant it?
Right. So for that example, I am talking to Father Ohio, the river I mentioned, Grandmother Monongahela, who is the river like the steel mill is actually on. The martyrs of the Homestead Rebellion, which was a like Union uprising that turned into a bloody massacre. Andrew Carnegie, who interestingly is a local spirit who like feels really bad about what he did. Like he did a lot of terrible robber baron shit until he hit about 30. And then he actually spent the next 30 years trying to buy off that blood debt with his fortune. So like he's a mixed bag, but he's very useful for things like containing the evil of a Carnegie steel mill. So there's a lot of spirit activity, but there's spirits who are like perhaps, I think in general, your best bet are spirits to whom you have a connection and also who like you share interest with. Do you know what I mean? Like they also want this thing I am doing. So it's not really like I'm getting them to work for me. It's like we are working collaboratively and I'm the one with the hands.
Right. And the iron spikes.
Yeah, like it's very hard for a dead person to move an iron spike. Very hard. Less hard for a river, but still hard. Harder than for a human.
So let's talk a little bit about your upcoming book, because your Orphic Hymns Grimoire is terrific. It has lots of great historical things in it. What do you're writing a book about a bunch of different kinds of incense. So what are you bringing to the table on that?
So I've been professionally making and selling incense for a long time. And really my goal is to like provide people, like people started asking me to write like a recipe book. Mm-hmm. And me being like the teacher nerd that I am, like, I don't really, I feel like the goal of a good cookbook is to teach you how to cook rather than to like provide you with specific recipes, right? So that was the same in my goal in this incense book. So my hope is that like by the time you get to the end of this book, you will be able to construct your own recipes for things, right?
But there are recipes in it though.
Yeah, so it's about half, like I go ingredient by ingredient. Like here's a bunch of ingredients you should have in your pantry. And I try and categorize them. So like if you're fancy, maybe you have frankincense and myrrh and pine resin and copal and dragon's blood. But like maybe all you actually need is pine resin from that pine tree outside your house. That'll do, right? So I categorize them into categories. So like you don't need that deep of a pantry.
I just found out that I'm fancy.
I mean, I'm also fancy, but I'm just saying, like, not everybody needs to be fancy
Sure.
in that sense. And you know, I will also say, like, there's a lot of ecological repercussions. Like, I feel worse and worse every time I buy frankincense, honestly. Like, I am phasing it out for pine resin because I just am uncomfortable with the way frankincense is raised and sold, both in an economic sense and also in a like slave labor sense. But I go individually through ingredients, right? And I really try and focus on ingredients that are relatively accessible, right? I will say there is definitely a bias when I talk about accessibility toward like the mid-Atlantic. Like, I understand mugwort to be so accessible that it is in every roadside ditch, right? So like, I'm not gonna lie, people who live in like Siberia or like New Mexico, then maybe their opinion, then maybe for them, like, it's not white pine resin that's easy to get, it's pinyon pine resin that's easy to get. But I talk about that as well, right? But it's definitely got some of my bias about where I live, which conveniently is actually where a lot of people, you know?
And mugwort is available commercially, so you can get it even not from a ditch if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, but there is some artemisia that grows in a ditch near you. So like, if you grow where mugwort doesn't, then maybe you should be using, say, blue sage, which is almost the same plant and grows where you live. I don't know where you live, but where people live, right? Like, wherever you live, I am confident that there is an artemisia growing in a ditch near you. That's the one you should use almost all the time. In my opinion, the bump you get from it being like the exactly right ingredient is more than swamped by the bump you get from having met that plant when it was still alive and could talk to you.
What about cultivating plants? Do you feel like that's acceptable as well, or?
Absolutely. So I grow a lot of plants. I didn't talk about that a lot in the book, only because like I'm not a gardener, and like other people, Harold Roth has an excellent book out recently about growing your own plants. And like, I mean, I can give like broad generic gardening advice the same way like the lady up the street from you who has a nice garden can, but like definitely not better than her, probably worse, except I know more about witch plants. So I talk about it a little, but not as much. So yeah, I think, a plant that you are in continuous communion with is best. Like a plant that you are caring for is best all the time. So anyway, about half the book, like I go through ingredients and I try really hard to both talk about like the special properties of that incense, but also talk about like how I knew that. So like the fact that like frankincense, right, repels insects tells me that it will also repel other kinds of invisible pests. I know I can use it for clearing because it like, I think a lot of times we look down on whatever doctrine of signatures, like that old-fashioned way to analyze a plant, but that's really what I'm saying. But like, I know what this plant does because I know what this plant is. Like, I know that Artemisia behave this way, and I know they do that largely because of like the chemical constituents of that plant, right? And so if I can kind of like, I know that any plant that will induce an abortion will also be beloved by any of those witch queen goddesses. Hecate, they'll like it if you like. They're just will like. There are things like there are connections that I can make that way, and so I try and talk a lot about that in the ingredient section to help people like learn how to use materials otherwise. Because if all they want is like an index to look them up on, I can't beat the internet for that. Like,
sure,
we already have Wikipedia. So then the second half of the book is recipes, right? And I like give a lot, and I tried to give like a really broad variety of incenses, including in types. So broadly, I sort of categorize them into 3, but maybe 4 types. The first of which is like incense to like set a vibe, which is kind of like the essential nature of incense. Like, that's at its most basic, what do you do with incense? You like make a room smell nice.
Right.
So I'll give you the recipe, like here's the recipe that's usually in my kitchen. Here's the recipe I burn at a party if I want it to be like real up-tempo, right? Here's my Bacchic revel incense, but here's my like Hobbit dinner party incense if I want to set that kind of tone. And I try to talk about like how I'm doing that, how I'm like imagining like the vibe that I want and then turning that into an incense. So that's one section. The next section is as an offering, which I actually think is the easiest one to create your own recipes because usually there's just kind of like formulas. Like, I know this god likes these things, I'm gonna mix them together, there, right?
Can we put a pin in? Can we put a pin in this for a second? Because I've got a question for you. That it'll only take a second. In the Orphic hymns, there's an incense that goes with pretty much most of the thing. Does that relate to what you're writing in this book, or is that because those seem like kind of odd in some ways sometimes?
A little bit, in the sense that, like, what I'm saying, when you're making an offering incense, like, there's a lot of historical data about what certain spirits want. Sure. Right? So, like, and the Orphic hymns are one source of that, but they're also, they had access to a very different, like, pantry of ingredients than we did, but also they're, like, burning them in a different environment. So, you know, one of the reasons that incense is such a good offering, right, is, like, first, it's really value dense. Like, it's a lot of money per weight. Right. And that just makes it easy to offer because you can transport it from far away, right? So it's like a luxury trade good, an exotic thing. That, like, there's this sense like, oh, you couldn't have gotten it somewhere else, only from me. Which is why, like, I don't put a lot of stock in, like, ordering the right ingredient off the internet. Like, if it's not weird, you don't get the bonus points for being weird if you got it from Amazon. You just don't, right? Like you didn't truck that on an elephant from Yemen yourself. Like, that doesn't count. But there's also, in a way that I think, like, look, I've said this a couple times, I think there is a way of learning and doing magic that you cannot learn if you only ever practice by yourself, right? And some of that is because there is magic you can't do alone. But it's also because, like, there are just little things about, like, ancient magic that suddenly make sense when you're doing them with other people. Like, incense is a great offering because you can see it from the cheap seats. Like, if you light incense on fire in the middle, it goes up. And if you light a lot of incense, like at a big public ritual, that plume of smoke is visible for quite a ways. You know what? I bet at Stonehenge, if you put a ton of incense in the middle, you'd be able to see that plume way outside the circle. And, like, that's important in a public ritual. Like, that's one of the reasons we use incense, right? It goes up, and it goes up straight, and it's quite visible for a long time, and you can smell it from quite far away. Right? And so, like, I think when you bring those kinds of understanding in incense, like, that's why I think the offering ones are a little easier, because there's a lot of just documentation about them. And the Orphic hymns are one of those, but so are lots of other sources. I will say, for the most part, I do not use the incenses listed in the Orphic hymns, except that frankincense or some other resin is sort of my go-to offering for celestial gods.
That was what I was wondering, is how much those inform your own practice and the book that you're writing, or that you wrote.
Very little, I would say. Except in the ways that, like I was saying before, the Orphic hymns and the culture from which they arose are just woven into our culture. Sure. So, like, my opinion that frankincense smells churchy, and therefore churchy spirits like it, like, yeah, that's what the Orphic hymns thinks too, is that the churchy ones like frankincense.
Right. My wife hates frankincense, which is interesting. I don't think it's from churchiness, but perhaps it is. So what's the third type of incense that you discussed?
The third kind is, I guess, what in Hoodoo you'd call, like, a condition formula. It's an incense that's designed to go with a very specific spell, right? So not even just a road opening incense, but, like, this particular road opening spell uses this particular incense. And that's, again, where I'm walking people through, like there's an explanation of, like, this ingredient is here to do this. This ingredient is here to do this, right? And they can use those sort of, like, pre-written, but they can also, in truth, like, I actually hope that more than using them and just directly making that incense, maybe a couple of times until they, like, get the hang of it, that really what it does is, like, empower them to, like, they have their own spell. They're gonna write, like, I'm sorry.
Okay, my cat's been coming in and out those whole times.
Okay. Yeah, so they're gonna write their own spell, right? And then they're gonna think about how to turn that spell into an incense recipe. And in truth, that's the same skill that you would use for making like any kind of like potion type magic, or even like you know, the kind of magic that's like a little bag and you put different kinds of stuff in it, or like a jar, like any of those things that are effectively like assemblage magic. Even though this is a book about incense, I think the skill you learn about how to turn a spell into a recipe, like you could do in any of those media. And so
how do you feel that you're teaching that skill in the book? Do
so
you have to go through the whole books, you know, every page of it and do everything in it, or?
Look, the book is definitely intended to, there's some instructions in the beginning. The book is definitely intended to be like, you start on page 1 and you read straight through to the end, right? That doesn't mean make everything in it, but like, I do think you should, you know, read the whole book. They do go in order, in the sense like, there are skills that I'm teaching in those early recipes about like how to understand what a spirit smells like from a text, right? That then I am doing like a more sophisticated version of in the spell, right? And I mean, you learn by example, the same way sort of humans learn anything. Like I really tear apart the same way you would teach somebody to cook. You're making a specific recipe, but you're explaining both like how you knew to put these flavors together and like how you knew to do these things in this particular order.
Well, I'm genuinely excited about this book because I mean, like I said, I like the little historical bits that you put in the Orphic Hymns Grimoire, and I'm sure that sort of is going to be all throughout this book as well.
There's
so
a lot of that, especially in the ingredients section. The ingredients section is basically that, but with a plant instead of a Greek god.
Okay. So are there ones that you didn't write as much about, like Athena, or?
There are sort of. I mean, there's partly ones I didn't write as much about because I don't really use them. So like copal, that's not really an incense ingredient I ever use. I have used it occasionally, like I know what it is, but I would really never use copal in a recipe because it's just like not a thing I keep in stock, basically. So there are some that I write less, and there are also some where like I sort of veered away from the more so like rose. I didn't spend a lot of time like telling people what roses smelled like, or like what the cultural association the roses were, or how to grow roses, because I sort of feel like they maybe already know that.
Right.
So I talked a little bit more about like, I'm always trying to think like, what do I think this person already knows? And I'm just going to mention that, and just enough that like if they didn't know it, Wikipedia will teach it to them, right? And then they can come back and learn the stuff that like they couldn't have learned on Wikipedia. But yes, some definitely have more than others.
And so in terms of your own practice, which we've, you know, sort of were talking about a few minutes ago, how much does incense play a role in that? Because we didn't even mention it when we were talking about it before.
A lot. So for like vibe setting, I guess it's my number one tool, right? Like my house always smells like something, and I did that on purpose, right? For offerings, it's my go-to offering. Like the most common offerings that I make. I guess the most common offering I make is a glass of water and maybe a candle, but it's like water, candle, incense is like my normative offering, right? For conditions, it depends. Like I do use incense for that, but a lot of times, you know, loose incense, in addition to burning it, like you can use it other ways. You can like grind it up and make an oil out of it. You can put it in a bath. Almost all incenses are basically the same in a bath. A lot of them you can smoke in a pipe. Some of them you can drink as a tea. Like it depends on what's in it. But like if you understand incense quite broadly to mean like an assemblage of plant ingredients that maybe I'm going to burn, but maybe I'm going to do something else with, then quite often, like I would say a significant amount of my practical magic is that.
If you were to give one piece of advice to a young person who's just getting started in magic, what would you tell them to do?
Get a teacher, an actual in-person that you can talk to teacher. If they teach not the kind of magic you want to learn, doesn't matter. Like whichever teacher you can get, learn from them, and you can go learn another kind later. But like, as I've said many times, I think that like, and if you can't get a teacher, get a partner. Like just have other human beings involved in your magic, because I really think it's so easy to fall into like self-delusion on one hand, right? Or like, I'm just making it all up, none of this is really real on the other hand. But you know what? When there's two of you in the room when that weird shit happens, it's a lot harder to fall off either of those cliffs. You know what I mean? Like having another person really keeps you honest in a way that I think it is hard to get in other ways. And it also like, people I know who like spent most of their magical career working only with themselves, their magic is really internal. And their ability, one, to like explain it is not that good because they've never had to do that. But also, remember what I was saying about their ability to like get it from them to a target? I feel like a lot of times when you're only working with yourself, it's really easy to stay in that place where your magic is only happening inside you. But again, if there's somebody sitting next to you while you do it, you have to externalize it for them, and they have to externalize it for you. And I really think like, I understand why when I was a kid, most people didn't have a co-magician. Like I lucked into meeting one, but in today's world where like there's an internet and you can meet people from everywhere, like I really don't think there's any excuse. Like when people tell me, oh, I can't find, like, I don't know, I think you're not trying hard enough. I think you either are so odious that no one will be in your presence, or like you're not actually trying to meet people. That's my advice.
I mean, I think that there is a natural inclination to feel sort of private about the matter. So, I mean, how do you think that people can sort of get past that? And I mean, it was natural for you, so maybe.
I mean, I honestly think it's like any other kind of stage fright. I think you just have to suck it up and do it. And like, you just have to get used to the fact that like you are definitely going to make a fool out of yourself. Like that is 100% going to happen. And like, I don't know, get okay with it. I know that's like a harsh position. That is also the position, by the way, that I have with like math students when I taught high school. It is not the position necessarily that I would take with really weak students. Like I would never send a weak student up to the board to make them do in public a problem I didn't think they could do. But the best students in the class, I will definitely send them to the board with a problem I know they can't do.
So that they learn something?
So that they learn how to figure out how to do it, right? So that they get and I do it too, right? I will find a problem that's hard enough that I can't do it, and I will get stuck. And I'll be like, okay, well, at this point, here's some stuff I know, and I'll kind of talk out loud about my process of how I get through that. But honestly, I think that fortune favors the bold, and really people who are too afraid to be wrong in public, I don't want to be harsh, but like maybe magic isn't for them.
So just one final thing on this.
Just do it.
There are a lot of magicians today, myself included, who offer some teachings over the internet, which obviously you feel is not going to be as valuable as someone in the physical presence of each other. But so how could we offer more in that realm that would allow people to get some of that feeling back from it? Like what would be a way of?
I've been thinking about this a lot because there's a plague and now I have to put it on. So I want to be clear. I think online teaching is great. And I think if it's a teacher that you can actually talk to, like you ask them a question and they answer it, like they are giving a lecture and in the middle of them, you put up your hand and ask a question. That counts in my mind as like a real teacher, right? A real in-person teacher that you are interacting with, as opposed to reading a book or watching a video, or in some other way, like I guess they're your teacher, but there's no actual like feedback from them on you. For very beginners, I do think in-person is important because like, especially the more like energy parts, I think it's hard to know if you're doing it right if there's not somebody like physically present there, like showing you how. But what I think you can do is outsource that to things that already exist. I don't think you need a sorcery teacher to learn that. I think you can learn the beginning of that from like the Qigong guy at the mall. You know what I mean? Like you need some kind of embodied energy practice, which I understand some people live like way out in the sticks. But I feel like for most people, like there is somebody teaching Tai Chi within 45 minutes of you. Like, maybe I'm spoiled from living in cities, but I really feel like somebody's teaching yoga, somebody's teaching Tai Chi, like, do something. Go to the snake handler church and learn it from them if you go.
That's certainly a possibility.
That's what I mean by, like, having a teacher is worth it, even if they're the wrong. Just like that Buckland book was, like, not a great book. But, like, I learned a lot of stuff from it because I didn't know anything. So there was a lot of low-hanging fruit that I could learn anywhere. So for beginners, I think, like, the more of an in-person connection you can get, the better. Even if you don't stick with that teacher.
Sure.
Like, even if you learn whatever it is they have to learn that you want to learn, and, like, they got a lot of junk that you don't necessarily want to learn at all, right? Like, squeeze what you can out of them, and then you can, like, bootstrap that into a better teacher. Like,
but snake handling church is probably lower on the list of suggested teachers, yeah?
I mean, I guess that's what you want to learn. Like, in truth, if I had never seen, like, no, I feel like learning how to get filled up and, like, with a spirit and preach the word, like, you can learn that at a snake handling church. Like, you just need to watch somebody do it a couple times, and you're like, oh, I bet I can do that. And then you just try and do it.